Mr. Nicholas Hill, welcome to the show. So happy to have you on. How are you doing today?
Great. Happy to be here.
Yes, I appreciate your time. I appreciate the generosity with your time, and I'm looking forward to hearing and learning a lot from you. I started an economics series about a year ago, and I had some fun guests on. And the one thing that I did want to start looking a little bit more into, and perhaps trying to draw a little bit more attention to, is the importance and the relevance of antitrust, breaking up monopoly, because I think we live in a world at the moment where big businesses are so enormous that the power that they have, it's certainly not unprecedented, but it kind of goes and it ebbs and flows with waves throughout history, particularly American history. But I wanted to just maybe understand this a little bit, and I think you're the right person to help me break down some of these ideas in a really clear and coherent way.
Sure. Happy to help.
Just a little bit on your background. You had some time working at the DOJ and the FTC. DOJ stands for the Department of Justice. The FTC is the Federal Trade Commission, and then you went private. And I don't actually know where you're working at the moment, but
Sure. Yeah,
yeah,
I can
maybe
give
you
you a
could
little
just tell me a little
background.
bit about yourself and your past experiences.
Yeah, so I'll give you some background and you can cut out all the parts that are boring. So,
Sure.
prior to going into antitrust, I actually worked in demographic and health surveys in developing countries. And I did that for about 5 years. And for various reasons, I was ready to change what I was doing a little bit. And I went back to grad school to get a PhD. And after I did that, when I was applying to jobs, my supervisor at the time told me, you should apply to some government jobs. And he said it largely because he said something not entirely flattering, like, yeah, most of these academic places wouldn't hire someone like you. So maybe you should try a government job.
What made him say
So I did
that?
apply to a bunch of government. You'll have to ask him. Possibly he was just right. He was just
Okay.
possibly very perceptive. So anyway, I interviewed with the Department of Justice Antitrust Division. I didn't really know anything about antitrust at the time, and I heard them talking about what they did and why, and they in particular talked about mergers. Two companies are trying to merge, and we have to determine whether or not that would hurt consumers. And they gave some examples, and it just really caught my imagination. I liked talking to them. I thought it was great. So, they invited me out. I talked to their group. I gave a presentation, and the more I talked to them, the more I liked them, and the more interested I was. And eventually, for reasons that will never be clear to me, they offered me a job and I accepted. And there was definitely a learning adjustment. I mean, I really didn't know much about antitrust, so I learned through talking to the economists, talking to the lawyers, working on cases. I really, in that sense, I had an economics background. Obviously, I have a PhD in it, but a lot of it was just working with people. And so I was there for 7 years. I moved to the FTC, as you said, the Federal Trade Commission. They do the same things in general, but they have different industries. Like DOJ and FTC often work on different industries, and I was interested to see how do these industries work? Do we kind of have the same theories, the same ideas? And after being there for a while, I moved back to DOJ to be in a manager's role. And then after a couple of years of that, I went private and I joined Bates White Economic Consulting, which is where I work today.
Gotcha. That's a lot. That sounds like quite a trip too. There's a couple of things that you said that I'm very curious about. Maybe if you could help clarify. Number one is it seems like the way that you just phrased it that the end goal or what the purpose of the DOJ was that your impression was, which what got you excited, is that it's that the government was there to protect, excuse me, protect consumers. So the it looked like that the audience or the people that the DOJ was looking to protect and defend are the American people, not necessarily the corporations that, in fact, they would be trying to prohibit them from growing. Is that correct?
Yeah, so not necessarily prohibited from growing, but your first part is absolutely correct. The goal of both the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission is to make sure that firms don't acquire market power or use market power in ways that harm consumers.
Hmm.
And so that is really their foundational focus. Now, obviously, whenever there's an election, the people who are in charge of the divisions, there's sort of the career staff, the people who are there long term, and then there's political staff who come in, and different political staff may have different views. And so,
Right.
one administration may be very focused on breaking up monopolies. One may be very focused on merger review. It really depends on their specific
That's
orientation, and
interesting. That's really cool.
some
I
are,
didn't even think
yeah,
about that.
yeah, and the Federal Trade Commission, they actually typically now they currently they have two, but they usually have five commissioners, usually three from the majority party, two from the minority party. And what's interesting about that is when I moved from DOJ to FTC, I found out that commissioners don't always align the way you think. You might think there would be a lot of 3-2 votes where all the Republicans vote one way and all the Democrats the other. That does happen
Right.
for sure, but there's also times when all five of them vote together, and there's times when it's 4-1, and there's times when it's 3-2, but it's not a predictable coalition. So, like, different people have different views. At DOJ, there's really usually the one decision maker. Now, of course, that
Mhm.
person is responsible ultimately to the attorney general, but it doesn't have quite that same structure.
Right, right. I'm so happy that you made that point because I'm reading a book now called The Unstable Majorities by Morris Fioran, I believe is his last name. And one thing that he was talking about was how the population is much more polarized, perhaps, than they need to be. And I was curious, and a lot of social issues are kind of worked into the political parties now in order to help deviate, I think, people from one another or radicalize the extremes from either party. And I was curious whether that kind of same environment exists within the government itself, because, like you did mention, there are people that come in every 4 years or so from with whatever respective parties in a position of power, and then there are people that just work there throughout, the whole time, one way or the other, and they say, okay, well, you'll be gone in 4 years, and we'll still be here in 20s. So I'm curious. So it's very interesting when you say that they're often, 4-1 or 5-0. I guess it means that these individuals, these commissioners, tend to have their own uh, ideas, and then instead of just going partisan one way or the other, they kind of elaborate. They kind of take a look at what's going on around them and base what their decision is going to be on their own values, as opposed to just going along with the party line.
Yeah, so that's a rich question, and I'll unpack it a little bit if I can. So first of all, in your
Please.
first point, yeah, I mean, there is this eternal battle between the civil servants and then the politicals who have their own political goals,
Hmm.
which may or may
Sure.
not be what the civil servants want. And I would say, in general, the people at both that I worked with at the DOJ and the FTC, their focus usually is pretty heavily on protecting American consumers. Like
Hmm.
they get paid a lot less than they would get paid in private practice, and they work really long hours. And so in general, pretty motivated by the mission. Now, there are some people who
Right.
may or may not be so motivated, but there's a lot of people who are. And then, yes, there's a political overlay where a particular party may be more or against a certain thing, and sometimes the parties align. So, one thing that's happened in the recent past, possibly for different reasons, but both of the major political parties have sort of had Amazon, Google, Facebook in the crosshairs, Apple, and they've been very
Hmm.
interested in large tech companies and the power that they have and a desire to regulate them or not
Hmm.
regulate, sorry, to investigate what they're doing. So that's true. And then there are other time periods when they have different views. And there, sometimes you're in a period of consensus, sometimes you're in a period of discord. And at the moment, with respect to big tech, there is some consensus about they need to be investigated. The reasons why may vary. And so the prescriptions about what should be done may vary. But all of that's true. And then the final overlay I just want to put on all of this is I'll just give you a hypothetical situation. Let's say Coke said we're merging with Pepsi, and there was a big investigation. Like, would this hurt competition for soft drinks? And the depending on which party is in power, they may have their own view about whether that's true or not. But if the government, whether it's the Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission, says we want to block this merger, we think this is going to lead to higher prices for colas, it's going to lead to higher prices for lemon lime soft drinks, we think this
Hmm.
needs to be blocked. They then have to go to court, and they have to convince a court that this should be blocked. And so then there's this other overlay, even if you have a big change in politics at the level of the political administration, ultimately the either agency has to typically convince a court. And so that's
Right.
like a yet another layer, like some federal judge is going to review this case. My experience, I've testified, I think now, I can't remember if it's 7 or 8 times in front of federal courts. The judges are super smart. They ask a ton of questions. They're really engaged, and it's really
Mhm.
hard to win those kinds of cases. The judges are really going to dig in and try to understand it. And so all of these parties, like the political parties, the judiciary, and then the civil servants are involved. And typically the way it works, if you have this Coke Pepsi, the career staff would investigate. They would say, here's the fact pattern, here's what we recommend. And then the
Mhm.
political leadership would make a decision. Are we going to sue? Or are we not going to sue? And then, you either move to court, or if you sue the court parties and they say, okay, you're right, we're going to abandon the deal, then it doesn't move to the judiciary, but otherwise you would move into a trial.
That's very interesting. Out of curiosity, I don't know if this is something that the DOJ or the FTC handles, but say, for example, and I want to talk about this too. We're going to get into Spirit Airlines a little bit, but part of what made Spirit so successful, and they kind of did upend the whole flight industry. I think either them or Frontier. I'm not sure which one of them came first, but I think they really radicalized and changed the way, almost a similar way to the way that Netflix affected the streaming and movie business in a very, they just kind of changed the whole grounds and the whole public perception of the way the business should be or is, and the way it works. And now that Spirit's gone, say hypothetically, and I read this, that airports that Spirits were flying out of were generally, I think, 15 to 20% cheaper than airports that Spirit would not fly out of. And one of the reasons why was because they were so competitive with their pricing, the other organizations and other airlines had to lower their prices just to compete with them. But now that that's gone, there's no barrier to, or there's nothing to stop necessarily these airlines from now marking up their flights to whatever it is. And in fact, we do know, of course, circumstantially due to the war right now, that air travel is extremely expensive because of the rising cost of fuel. So does DOJ get involved when a whole industry becomes too expensive for for people to be able to kind of participate in, or is that not up their roadhouse?
Yeah, so it could. So let me step back, and I'll start with your point about airlines. So and I'm not I've worked on the industry a number of times, including I worked on JetBlue Spirit on behalf of JetBlue and Spirit.
Oh, cool.
So let me just walk back there a little. So my understanding of the general industry trends, and some of this happened before I was involved, was that after deregulation, what sort of happened is airlines moved from, you could think of them as being high quality, high price. New people came in competing and saying, like, look, I really don't care if it's luxury. I just want to get from New York to Washington, or I want to get from
Hmm.
Miami to Milwaukee, and I want to do it as cheaply as I can. And there's been a series of people who have entered and led to lower fares. And the most famous, probably, and there's been a lot of economic papers written about it, is Southwest, who entered flying from point to point. They didn't have the same structure as United or Delta or American, who often have networks. They just were flying place to place, and they entered with low
Hmm.
fares and lots of flights. And they've really reshaped the industry. There's, as I said, there's a ton of economic papers looking at that and finding that Southwest had a really important impact. And then over time, other people entered. There was AirTran, and there's just been a whole long series of them. And so the way people often talk about the industry now is the legacy carriers, by which they mean often United, Delta, and American. So they have these
Hmm.
networks and hubs that you fly. If you're in a small airport, you usually fly to a big airport, and then you fly to where you're going.
Sure.
And then there's the point to point low cost carriers. So like Southwest was the classic example. JetBlue is often put into this category. You can get a flight
Allegiant.
for less, and you'll fly place to
Yeah.
place. Allegiant, they're going to be in an entirely different category. But Southwest, famously, they just gave you peanuts. Like, look, if you're looking for a fancy dinner, that's not going to be us. And
Yeah.
so that attracted customers who just wanted to fly. Like, I don't need a fancy dinner. I'll eat when I get to the other end. And then Spirit, Allegiant, Frontier, Velo. There's a whole bunch of Velo. Sorry, there's a whole bunch of what are then called ultra low cost carriers. Like they cut it down even further. Like, do you want a pillow? If you do, you're going to have to pay for it. And do you want any
Mhm.
kind of food or drink? You're going to pay for it. You want a blanket? You're paying for it. You want a bag? You pay for it. So it's like the ultimate, you can get a flight for like rock bottom. And it, just as an FYI, there was a company in Europe, I think as far as I know, they're still around, EasyJet, who just flies really, really cheap prices. And that general idea was popular with a lot of consumers. Like if you don't have
Yeah,
a lot of money, you don't want to pay a lot to fly, but you do want
right.
to get from point A to point B in just a couple hours. And so that's sort of what happened in a very high sense. And then one thing that has happened is those ultra low cost carriers are usually the easiest to enter. Like if you and I wanted to start an airline, we just need to round up a couple of airplanes and some pilots, and we'll fly back and forth between a couple of cities. And so it's pretty
Right.
common that people enter there. That legacy airline space, the United, the Americans, the Deltas, the very large airlines, I just named the three that people know about. I guess you could add Southwest now as a very large airline, but it's really hard to
Sure.
enter up there. And also, as we found with Spirit, ultra low cost carriers run out of money. Like they're operating on really tight
Mhm.
margins. And if something goes wrong, like there's a shock to the cost of fuel, they can all fail. And so coming now finally all the way back to your question, like both of the agencies at a high level, they are interested in what's happening in industries and they typically specialize. So DOJ works on airlines, FTC generally does not. And if they
Mhm.
heard like everyone is raising prices, they might launch an investigation to say, is this are prices high because fuel is high, so it's expensive for the airlines, or are prices high for some other reason, some reason like competition's being restrained in some way? And so
Mm.
that can happen. Like, for example, a lot of the investigations into, there was a whole bunch of them into Amazon and Google, et cetera, the big tech companies. Those came out of people saying these companies have too much power. It's leading to higher prices. We want to investigate. And when that happens, either the federal government could do it or some states do it. So,
Yeah.
New York has been active, California, Texas. Sometimes states investigate those things.
Yeah, and I wanna ask about that. I wanna stick on the I wanna actually definitely wanna talk about that. I wanna stick on the airline question the topic just a little bit more, because I wanna hear about your experience with the JetBlue case. I wanna hear, what the train of thought or what the business plan was and why it was ultimately struck down. And one of the also, something curious, I don't believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I remember when JetBlue started, everyone was enthralled by it. They had great snacks, they had the first, cable television, in the seats in front of you, and I think they had Wi-Fi in their flights, and they were really considered a
Oh, yeah.
premier airline. I remember I was jealous every time I heard that my friends were flying JetBlue and I was flying American. And then somewhere along the line, something happened, and it's funny because I don't think I ever age until I talk to my high school students, and that's when I realize how much older I am than I think I am. But so it looks like that company kind of went from a flip to a premier airline to a budget airline or an ultra budget, depending on I don't know how you're going to categorize it. But what is that? How does that happen? And then if you could maybe walk me through the case a little bit, I'd be really interested in hearing about that.
Sure, I'll look through both of those at a high level based on my experience. So, JetBlue, in some sense, positioned itself as you get a little bit of the best of both worlds. We're going to have, as you say, they had comfortable seats, extra leg room,
Hmm.
other perks like free Wi-Fi, look good in-air snacks, all those kinds of things. And so they were sort of saying, look, you can get the high quality, and we're also going to charge less than the larger carriers like American, United, and Delta and Southwest. So that was sort of
Hmm.
their pitch, that in-between space. Spirit was, we are flying, this is going to be a rock bottom fare. You're going to fly for cheap. And then at the other end, you have the legacy carriers who offer, first class or business class, more high
Hmm.
touch, sort of experience. And also like broader networks and like broader frequent flyers. Like it's surprising how many people you run into are like, I only fly Delta or I only fly American, I only
Yeah.
fly United because I've got all my points and I love my points and I want them. And that's why. And so they have those broad networks, whereas most of the other airlines just aren't big enough to do that. Southwest is also in that category. And so the genesis of the deal, the thesis for JetBlue was, look, when we enter a route, and we analyzed this and found this to be true. When we enter a route, prices come down from the large carriers. So United, American, Delta, Southwest, our
Right.
quality is close enough to them that they respond and they lower prices. But we're really struggling to get additional airplanes and to enter into more routes. Like we'd love to be competing in more places, but we just don't have the aircraft. And so they, in
Mhm.
some sense, saw this as an opportunity. And by the way, I'm just speaking for myself. The JetBlue people may tell you something completely different, but this was my perception
Sure.
as working on behalf of them. We can get all these additional airplanes and we can put more pressure on what I'll just call the big four, just for the purpose of this discussion: United, American, Delta, and Southwest. And
Mhm.
something like 80% of all flights in the country are on those four major carriers. And so their thesis was, if we could do this, we're going to take those planes, we're going to refit them to be like JetBlue planes, more legroom than you would have had on Spirit, free Wi-Fi, good snacks, all that stuff. And so we analyzed this, and we did find our work was consistent with JetBlue. When they entered, they put more pressure on the four largest carriers than other carriers did. And
Mhm.
so, and then the DOJ story though was, wait a minute, that may all be true, but there are some routes today where Spirit competes with JetBlue. So I'll just take a made up route. And this
Sure.
is completely made up because I don't remember. Let's say Fort Myers to Cincinnati. They're the only two people flying that. And today
Mhm.
they're competing for customers on that route.
Oh,
And what's going to happen
interesting.
is now people flying from Cincinnati to Fort Myers are going to have to pay more. And our counter argument was, okay, but JetBlue is going to enter a whole bunch of new routes, put pressure on the airlines that most people actually fly with. So that's going to benefit a
Right.
lot of consumers. And then another part of it was, look, ultra low cost carriers, they're constantly Breeze entering, Avelo entering, Allegiant entering, expanding. There's always new entrants there. And so you shouldn't be too worried about Spirit disappearing because it'll be replaced and we'll use Spirit's planes. And Spirit had nice new planes, just FYI.
Right.
So that was sort of the battleground. DOJ saying, we're going to lose this competition. We like this competition between JetBlue and Spirit. We were saying, you may lose that competition, but you're going to gain additional competition. And the court eventually, my reading of what the court said was, I think it's true that you would get this additional competition. I think that's good. But I think that there are a lot of people who like flying on Spirit, and they're going to lose their choice because the idea was
Right.
to replace the Spirit planes and make them JetBlue planes. So they'd be a little more expensive, they'd be higher touch. And the court was saying, but there are people who don't want that. And I'm not convinced that the smaller, ultra low cost carriers could expand and replace that lost competition. And so that's essentially what happened. And obviously, since then, Spirit went bankrupt. It's not clear where its planes are going to go. There's been a lot of people who've lost access to that service. And so that didn't turn out very well retrospectively. The
No.
bankruptcy was an unfortunate thing.
Not at all, not at all. That whole deliberation process is very interesting, and it's really fascinating to hear how what the arguments kinda came down to, in the sense that also because if the federal government was really concerned about losing that route to that customers wouldn't have the opportunity to take a economically feasible flight, from Cincinnati to Fort Myers, hypothetically, we do have airlines like Frontier and Allegiant, and I mean, I would imagine that the natural nature of competition is that someone will emerge or something will emerge to fill in that spot. Don't we believe that, or wouldn't you argue, or I guess you did, right? Representing JetBlue, that someone else would just step in and take that over?
Yeah, so there was testimony on this point at the trial. And in general, I would say, characterizing it at a high level, from when I was sitting in the courtroom, the ultra low cost carrier said, if there is an opportunity, if Spirit exits a route because of the merger, and
Uh-huh.
prices go up, we're always looking for routes we can enter and compete. And we are definitely going to take advantage of that. And the counter argument from DOJ was, look, but Spirit is the largest and most influential of these. It would be hard to replace them. And so that's sort of,
Ah,
and the court was persuaded by that. And that was, I think that, again, I'm reading between the lines in the court's opinion. And so the court said this would be a really serious loss. It I don't know that the court appreciated or understood because it wasn't super clear at the time, including to me, that how much at risk Spirit was of bankruptcy, and they started running into financial problems pretty quickly afterwards. And also, just context, I don't know if you know, but there was also, prior to the merger deal between JetBlue and Spirit. Spirit had an agreement with, or was being courted by, Frontier, and there was an idea that
right.
Frontier and Spirit merge. And so there was a big tussle between who would try to merge, and eventually Spirit and JetBlue merge. the Spirit and Frontier would have also been interesting. I didn't personally work on that or analyze that. That would have been the two largest ultra low cost carriers
Yeah.
merging, and they're
That
pretty
has its own
similar in some
problems, right?
ways. It would certainly have gotten a hard look from the agency to say, "Wait a minute, you've got the 2 biggest." Now, maybe they would have cleared it, I don't know. I didn't work on that, I didn't analyze it, but
Sure.
they're also pretty similar, and whereas JetBlue and Spirit at least were relatively different from each other.
So when you're getting called to testify on this on this stuff, or you're called to represent a company like JetBlue, what's your process for learning their argument? What's your process for defending them? What's the process for your homework? How do you go about preparing yourself for this? Because I mean, you're kind of getting brought into a whole world, and I mean, there's so many different universes. You could talk about supermarkets and airlines and studios and tickets and everything like that, and you got to learn about all these worlds, and these are complicated worlds that you have to dive into. How much time do you generally have to prepare? How do you go about that? What's that like?
Yeah, so that is one reason why I love working on antitrust, and it keeps it fresh. Like each new case you
Hmm.
work on is like some new industry where they compete in a different way, and you have to figure out who's competing with whom, how does this business work, what are they really selling, who's supplying them. You have to understand all of those details, and that is just it's both sometimes extremely complicated, and it's almost always really worthwhile to learn and exciting
Hmm.
to you. So you do it a lot of ways. You read documents, you read about the industry generally, you talk to people in the industry. And so, I should just say, also stepping back a tiny bit, I work both for firms. So, for example, on JetBlue Spirit, I worked on behalf of the parties, JetBlue and
Okay.
Spirit. I also worked on the Kroger Albertsons merger, which was where the FTC challenged that merger and they won in court. The
Hmm.
court ended up blocking that merger. There, I testified on behalf of the FTC, so I was testifying on behalf of the government, and so I've testified throughout my career pretty evenly for both sides, and that's a key point, and it goes to your question. Like the first thing I try to do is look at the data, look at the documents, look at the facts, and try to determine would this merger say have an impact on competition? Would it make consumers worse off, or is this one where there's already plenty of competitors present in the industry? It's not likely to have a big effect. And so that's
Right.
because, unlike lawyers whose job is to advocate for their client, as an economic expert, your job is to tell the truth. Like you are under oath, and everything you say in court has to be the truth and the whole truth.
Hmm.
And so if you don't believe whichever side you're with, you tell them as soon as you can. Like, by the way, I think if you're talking to the parties, I think your deal is anti competitive. You should find a different expert. Or if you're talking to the government, I don't think this deal's a problem. So probably find somebody else. Those are always
Right.
awkward conversations to have, but ultimately you have to tell the truth. So,
Yeah.
that's the first part. But you're right. It's fascinating. You end up becoming for a while an expert in a part of the world that sometimes, the very first case I ever testified on involved this chemical called titanium dioxide. It's used in paints to make them brighter, for example, like white paint,
Uh-huh.
make it really bright. Sometimes it's used in other things, to make like the different kinds are used for different products, but it's sometimes used in toothpaste to make toothpaste look very white and bright. I
Sure.
didn't know this product existed before I worked on it. I had not the slightest clue what it was. And it
Yeah.
turns out there are different ways of making it. Different people compete to make it. And so that whole process of learning, and then you have to understand how does the economics of the industry work. It's just fascinating, and you just learn something new every day, and you interact
Yeah.
with a lot of people, which is fun.
I bet it sounds incredible. It really sounds very cool. And as someone that, loves doing this just, just for fun, just because I think this is valuable. And I think these are important things for people to learn. I think the pursuit of information in general is awesome. If you could do that as for a living, then all the credit to you for sure. Do people make decisions as to whether or not how they're going to conduct business moves or attempt to make business choices based on the political parties that are in charge at the time? So, for example, Netflix, no, sorry, not any, let's say Spirit JetBlue again. I don't, we could stick with the same example. Would they be inclined in the same way to try to make the deal with a left or right candidate in the executive office, or would they typically it doesn't make a difference. The DOJ is pretty objective, or at least the representatives that are working there full time, like yourself, that are going to be the real layer of most of the operations. are they objective enough that people are comfortable just doing that?
Yeah, the answer is they can be. So it mostly shows, I think it shows up probably most in mergers. And
Mhm,
typically, stereotypically, Republican administrations are more likely to approve mergers than Democratic administrations. Now, the opposite definitely happens. There may be a deal that a Democratic administration would block and a Republican one would not, and then vice versa, one that a Republican administration would block and a Democratic one would not. And so it still comes down to the individual. But I think the way people usually perceive it is you're more likely to have a challenge under a Democratic administration. So if two firms are thinking about merging and they think this one's a little more challenging, like the facts aren't quite as strongly in our favor,
mhm,
the general perception would be that's more likely to happen under a Republican administration than it is under a Democratic one. And
gotcha.
that brings up a separate issue. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I'm sure that changes with time because party standards shift as time goes on too. So I'm sure we're just talking about the moment, you know, the present, relatively modern history.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And one of the areas where it sometimes comes up is there's this idea in mergers where you might have a remedy. So suppose you have some merger that causes a problem in some particular area, but doesn't in another part of the country.
Mhm.
Imagine you have two firms that are making some product and the product doesn't go very far. So if you've got a factory, you're serving 100 miles, 150 miles, something like milk, it just can't travel that far. If you and I both own dairies and we want to merge, let's say you have a bunch of dairies on the West Coast, I have some dairies up in the upper Midwest, and then we both have one dairy in Florida that are right next to each other. And there's nobody else nearby.
Right.
So you might, if we want to merge, we might say to the government, hey, look, you're right. We compete pretty heavily in Florida. But look, there are all these other places we don't compete, and we think there are benefits for us joining. So how about this? We will merge in all those other areas on the West Coast and the Upper Midwest, and in Florida, we'll sell my dairy. So we'll sell it to some third party who'll compete, and that way, going forward, you have the same competition because
Cool.
today you and I compete. So that's a typical remedy. It's what's known as a structural remedy. Like we're just getting rid of some productive assets and we're giving them to somewhere else. That can surprisingly run into problems because it's sometimes the case that it's pretty hard to do whatever the business is. And you might worry that it wouldn't work very well afterwards. So, for example, I worked on the Kroger Albertsons merger, and there the parties were proposing to divest a bunch of stores. They said, look, okay, these stores are close to the other side store. We'll sell one of the stores, and that should resolve the problem. And an issue they ran into is that there had been past mergers where grocery stores got together and they divested stores. And what happened in a
Mhm.
few of those is any of those stores failed. And so the competition didn't get maintained. It would be like in my dairy example, you and I merge, we sell my dairy in Florida. The new person can't quite figure it out. It goes out of business. And now customers in Florida, in this example, they just have your dairy to buy from and they can't play it off against mine anymore. And so with those remedy questions, one thing the previous administration, the Biden administration, they were very strident about consumers shouldn't take the risk that a divestiture is going to fail. And so if you have a divestiture that we're pretty sure is not going to fail, that's fine. We'll consider that and we might accept it. But we're not super interested in divestitures where there's any kind of risk, and we don't think consumers should bear that risk. Another
Sure.
administration might say, yeah, look, maybe it'll fail, maybe it won't. But we're pretty confident that it's likely not to, and so we'll be happy to go ahead. So that's another thing that comes up, and it's not uncommon to be arguing in court, like, is this divestiture enough to resolve the competitive problem?
And does that happen often in the case that that companies will merge, and then they just won't be able to conduct their business? I mean, I guess one of the most famous cases was the AOL case in the early 2000s where who'd they buy? Was it Verizon AOL? I don't remember what it was. I remember that there was a spectacular failure in the early 2000s with a tech company.
Yes, and so that one I'm not familiar with, but in general, both agencies do what are called retrospective studies from time to time. So they look back and say, we made a divestiture. Did it work? Did it not work? And often the answer is it worked. So I worked on a beer
Mhm.
merger when I was at DOJ, and we divested a brand. So it was Labatt's in sort of upper New York's upper in New York, let's just say,
Yeah.
and it was divested to a buyer. The buyer got a brewer. a brewery, they continued to make it, they continued to compete, it all went fine. And then there are other ones where, for example, in Kroger Albertsons, in one of the previous deal, which is been between Albertsons and Safeway, some of the grocery stores went out of business. And part of the reason was, if you think about wherever you buy your groceries, the name of that is what's called in the industry the banner. So if it's Safeway, Safeway is the banner. Consumers are
Sure.
attached to that. Like, I know when I go to a Safeway what I'm gonna find. If I rebrand it as Hills,
Mhm.
people may be like, I don't know about this Hill guy. I don't know about his stores." And now I lose a bunch of my customers, and now I'm out of business. Something like that happened with Whole Foods. Whole Foods had an earlier merger with Wild Oats, and a couple of the divested stores just completely failed. Once you lose that brand, that can be really challenging. Surprisingly, there's a lot of sort of things that look like a remedy that might work, and yet there's nevertheless there's a challenge in court.
That's really cool. It's really fascinating examples as to how, because, you could just take 2 books and compare them with one another and say, "Hey, it should work out," but there's a lot of factors, I guess, that we don't that we wouldn't naturally think about, like brands and stuff like that, and you're completely right. I mean, it's the reason why people like to buy Rice Krispies instead of Crispy Rice at Aldi's or something like that, or
Yeah.
we have an attachment, and I love to get sold, so I'm certainly guilty of being one of these participants, but I think that there is a value to brands, and I think that you're right. People do have attachments to them. It's really cool. I would love to touch a little bit on the states versus federal application of antitrust and monopolies and stuff, because I didn't even really realize that this could have been it could be a state issue. When would this come up that a state would hypothetically have an issue with a merger, but a government wouldn't, or vice versa? And and how does that get resolved between the state and the government?
Yeah, so the federal government has the DOJ and the FTC. Let's just say those are the two biggest antitrust agencies. But then most
Mhm.
states, so Florida, for example, will have, as part of its attorney general's office, will have someone who's looking at antitrust issues in Florida. And so, in our
Okay,
earlier example, if we just have a merger in Florida between your dairy and my dairy, and people are concerned about it, Florida might move in and look at that. Or if it's in Louis, whatever state you want to pick, it could be in Minnesota. There's two
sure.
areas there. That state may look at it if all the merging parties are located in that state. Or if they think for some reason their consumers are vulnerable under the merger, and the federal government, for whatever reason, doesn't. And so an early example of this and was the Sprint T-Mobile merger. And there,
Yes.
Sprint and T-Mobile were merging, and at a high level, you could say there were four at the time large cell phone providers: Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, and T-Mobile. Sprint and T-Mobile were, I think it's fair to say, number three and number four. And so they were merging, and the federal government worked out a remedy, some agreement with the Sprint and T-Mobile. You'll do certain things, you'll take certain actions, and if you do that, we think that the transaction is okay. But a bunch of states, led by New York, said even with those remedies, we still think this is going to hurt consumers in New York, and so
Mhm.
they brought a lawsuit in New York, and they actually ended up losing. It is a challenging position for the states sometimes, because in that case, the federal government had reached an agreement saying, we don't think this transaction is going to harm consumers in the United States. And then New York says, well, we think it does. And so that can be a challenge, in the dynamics in the courtroom as New York, because now the judge may be thinking, but wait, you guys say it's not, but the federal government said it was. Why do you have different positions? And you sort of have to work through that. But you can also have cases where, let's say, two hospitals merge in Wyoming, and the Wyoming Attorney General is interested, but the federal government just says, you know what, Wyoming, you can deal with this. Traditionally, many of the cases have been done by the FTC and the DOJ. They've typically had larger resources. These antitrust cases can be pretty expensive and time consuming.
Yeah.
One thing that's happened over the last, I would say, 4 years, the states have really become very active in bringing antitrust cases on their own. Groups of states or individual states, and has really changed things a lot. Like, there's a whole new set of people. If you're thinking about doing a deal, you don't need to just get approval from the federal government. You need to make sure that the states are also on board with your merger.
Hello,
Did we
hello?
lose each other?
Hang on, I think
I
Okay, sorry about that. We had an extended break, longer than I wanted. But my question was, I'm sorry about that, was, is there a precedent for states being more involved now in antitrust? Is this, do you think, a temporary thing because of a cultural or social phenomenon that's going on? Or do you, or what do you think is the reason why so many states are getting involved as opposed to the federal government?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I definitely think they have become more involved, and I don't think it's as simple as I mean, antitrust has now become, in some ways, a more popular political issue. There used to be
Hmm.
something of a sort of a consensus view of antitrust, and there's been attacks on that in various ways. And so now there's maybe more diverse opinions, and so different states just see things differently, and they're moving forward with cases that in the past, at the beginning of my career, certainly it was not uncommon for states to be involved. So the federal government would file a lawsuit, some states would join, but usually the federal government was doing most of the actual litigating. And
Hmm.
now you have states doing cases that have never involved the federal government. And, in the Live Nation case, for example, the federal government settled and then the states went ahead. And there are definitely other examples, and a little while it was a little while ago, but there's also the Sprint T-Mobile case. So now the states are in there also bringing these cases, and it's a real shift. And I don't know how long it will last. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, antitrust cases are expensive, and so if the people in the states feel like they don't want their representatives spending money that way, then maybe that'll change. But
Yeah.
for now, that's definitely seems to be a major shift, and it doesn't seem to be going away.
It's very, yeah, and I would venture a guess and say that the public sentiment at the moment has shifted from issues of left to right that a federal government could at least say that they're participating in, and I think a lot of people feel that big corporations are more of an issue for everyday Americans than a left or right party member, and so I think that the general sentiment at right now, that's just my feeling of the zeitgeist at the moment, that there's just more of there's a political blame going towards big corporations, and perhaps rightfully so. I'm not sure exactly. I don't know enough of the details, but I could imagine that that is what would popularize such a movement.
Yeah. No, I mean, it kind of, in some ways, it took a lot of people by surprise. The
Hmm.
building of this momentum for looking into the big tech companies and for investigating them closely. I think prior to all those investigations, and I'm not intending to pick on Google at least at all. It's just that their cases have been out there and have been the most
Hmm.
public. I think most people probably had a positive view of Google. And then there were, from both the left and the right, people said, we need to look into Google. There was an investigation. There were these cases. They lost two of them, which are now, they're trying to decide how they're going to remedy the harm. And, that's a real shift. I mean, I think
Yeah.
10 years ago, Google would have been pretty popular with the average consumer. And so
Yeah.
it is a fascinating development. And yeah, it's not I'm
And
not
was
entirely
and
clear what's driving it.
you could almost imagine, by the way, I was curious about this while I was thinking about this, and while we are thinking about our conversation, was there's an enormous amount of competition in the AI world, which seemingly sprouted from the enormous tech world of Google and Amazon and Meta, and you have kind of this company OpenAI with that was the real forefront of the AI world, and almost did feel like they were unanimous with the AI movement, at least in the from the consumer level or from a very superficial level. And all of a sudden, and perhaps it coincides as far as time goes with the scrutiny on the big tech companies, but there was an explosion of a variety of AI, of very successful AI companies, including Anthropic and Claude, which just got the almost $1 trillion valuation after just 5 years of existence. And so that market seems extremely competitive, but it's funny that it comes out of out of a market that only had a few players.
Yeah. No, it is very interesting. And, I think, um, something similar, um well, a couple thoughts. One, early in my career, I worked on a case that involved, like, text to speech. When you used to call the
Mm,
airline and say, "Hey, I want a flight," and it would say, please enter the first three digits of your city name. And then you never understood what you were talking about. And you ended up just saying operator, operator. And like those early, there was an early case about like, a couple people had that tech were like merging and it was like, their tech is so terrible. Will anyone notice or not? And now AI is so, so much better at that. The other day I got an email and it said, we drafted a response for you. It wasn't perfect, but it was not just coherent. It was like using turns of phrase that I use in my very idiosyncratic punctuation, like the way I always write my last name NH, just because it's quicker.
Mhm,
Like I don't have to write Nicholas or Nicholas Hill. And it did that. And, obviously it's drawing all this data in and trying to make things come out. And that is come out. Look, this is one of those things I've observed over my career that new technologies create a lot of anxiety. Like, what is it going to do? How is it going to affect me? And the more
mhm.
powerful a technology seems, the more threatening it is. Like, we don't
Yeah,
know what the end game is going to be. We don't know who it's going to replace, whose jobs are going to disappear, or how your day to day life will change. And that creates anxiety and people worry about it. And then to your point, it's a little bit like, was it 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Microsoft was in a very strong position with operating systems on computers. It seemed like they
mhm,
had the whole world locked up. And then here came the smartphone, and Apple had the first really interconnected, the iPhone came out and people were like, this is amazing. And then rivals appeared. Microsoft tried to get into that game. They had their own operating system for a while, and nobody really liked it. And so it kind of disappeared from the market. And now it's kind of Samsung and Apple, and then there's other players. Like I have a Pixel phone, and that world
sure.
is kind of to your point. Like you might have guessed, Microsoft will definitely be the next person. They'll dominate the cellular thing because they know how to do operating systems, and yet it didn't happen. And you're right, AI. It seems like there's hundreds of people out there fighting to be on the top, and who's going to be there? And the role for antitrust eventually will be, if someone gets into a strong position, are they using their strong position to exclude rivals? Like
Right.
antitrust people are happy when firms compete with each other because that competing with each other makes consumers better off. They don't
Yeah.
like it when do you find some way, potentially underhanded way to prevent people from competing with you. And as of now, I agree with you. It just seems like the wild, wild west. There's just lots of people out there doing it. So who knows where it'll end up? But it is a fascinating and anxiety inducing, development.
It's it certainly is. It certainly is. It's funny, I just did I think actually my last podcast episode that I recorded was with, former CFO of Pixar, and he took the company public. He was selected by Steve Jobs to do it. Extraordinarily sweet and intelligent guy, and one thing that he was describing to me, one of the challenges that he describes was when Pi it was Pixar was in a Pixar also started by Steve Jobs, had $50 million invested into privately by himself into the company to fund it at a low point in his career after he was already tossed out from Apple. And they and he says, I started Pixar has had 4 main businesses, 3 of them were awful, and the only one that was left was motion pictures. And then you're stuck dealing with Disney, who's the absolute behemoth. And he's like, and then Steve Jobs calls me and he goes, we need to negotiate with Disney. We have like a 10-year contract with them and they get 80-90% of the money, of the revenue and all and then any kind of, I think any sequel to any movie did not count as original IP that was going to the contract. And it felt like, and he said, you were just fighting this enormous, enormous behemoth. And somehow we did it. Somehow we kind of just poked this little hole in it, and we had this enormous overnight success with Toy Story. And all of a sudden, overnight, despite how enormous Disney was, Pixar became a legitimate enough player that we were able to go to the biggest names and the most powerful names in industry and say, "Hey, we want a seat at the table. We're gonna renegotiate our contract, and we're gonna change the terms and make it a little bit more favorable to us." So it shows that this kind of could be done without even needing any kind of government or formal intervention. It shows that if you kind of leave the market by itself and you have individuals like the Steve Jobses or the Apples or the Pixars of the world that they could really shake things up. It's similar, like you said, with Microsoft and the phones. That can really happen, and it's really really wonderful. And one thing that might make it a little bit more difficult, and I would love to kind of branch this into the next part of our conversation, although you can obviously respond to that first if you'd like, is the difference between a monopoly and a conglomeration, because I think that that's kind of the direction that we're heading towards. And maybe you could just give me some thoughts on what, what, or if you have any. If not, we could just jump into that, the conglomeration idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll give you thoughts on that first one. That actually you've identified what's a key issue in antitrust. Like, for example, if you're thinking about a merger, so you and I are thinking of merging our lemonade stands, and we're the only two lemonade stands in Washington D.C. or Florida, wherever you want. It's not that hard to make a lemonade stand. So, like, if you and I merge and we raise prices, somebody else is going to just set up a lemonade stand. And then there are other businesses where it's a lot more challenging. Like, for example, I was just talking about this with a colleague this morning. Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel are in a really, really strong market position. And it's just hard today sitting here to imagine who is going to replace those products and ever displace them. And so when you're thinking about a merger, you often think about it. And one of the things you think about is, could somebody just start a business and enter this and compete? If so, then maybe I'm not so concerned about mergers. If, though, it's really hard to enter or really unlikely to enter, then maybe I do care and mergers can really reduce competition. And so, one
Mhm.
area where you often see this is like hospitals. Like, people don't tend to build a lot of hospitals. And so, if all the hospitals in an area were to be owned by one person, you could imagine they might have some market power. But if we owned all the lemonade stands, you just buy some lemons, you buy some sugar, you buy some water in a blender, and you're ready to go. And maybe you might want something to filter it so you get rid of the lemon rind, but it's not that hard. And so that is what you're saying is really a key issue. And then you touched on something else that does come up too, which is, and you can also connect to hospitals, and I'll do that in a sec, but generally this idea of a conglomerate. I
Mhm.
own, a potato chip business, and I also own a bunch of soft drinks. Like, is that problematic? Do those compete? Like, usually, if I'm thinking about potato chips, I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to have a potato chip. I'm going to have a Pepsi instead. Like, that's not, you don't think about those in antitrust. We often think about what would consumers substitute to. Those aren't really direct substitutes for each other. But in some settings, it might be the case that if you own products that don't seem to be related, they can affect each other and they can reduce competition. And so that's where
Mhm.
theories of conglomeration start to come in. And one area that's been a pretty hot area of discussion and people are still trying to figure out how does it work, how does it not work is hospital cases. So traditionally it was, remind me what city you're in Florida?
I'm in Hollywood. The big system here is Memorial. Memorial Healthcare is huge here.
Yeah. And so you just take your local hospital, the largest local system, and if they were buying the second largest system, you might say, wow, that's a lot of, hospitals that are under one owner. That could be a problem. I don't know, maybe not. I don't know the local market. But now suppose they said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to buy a bunch of hospitals in Hollywood, California. And there's no way that you are saying, gosh, I just accidentally cut off part of my finger with my weed whacker. I need to go to the emergency room. I'm either going to go to the Hollywood hospital or I'm going to drive to California and go there. That's not happening. And similarly, but maybe there's some way in which owning those hospitals in a bunch of states could give them market power in a way that we haven't thought about before. And so people really are trying to think about this in the context of hospitals and figure out, is there an effect? Now, that's not quite the conglomerate because at least it's all just hospitals, but people will also think about if you what's called a vertical antitrust case. So an easy way to think about it, I find, is milk. So the cows produce raw milk, and that's
Mhm.
you can drink it, but that's not what's sold at the grocery store. That milk is then processed at a processing plant, and then that goes to the grocery store. If you had a vertical merger where somebody who owned all the cows bought a lot of processing plants and said, we're not going to let other people have their milk at our processing
Right.
plant, maybe they would cut off access. Now, there's been a bunch of cases on that, and I think it's really fact dependent. So that may or may not be true. But if you own an input into somebody else's business and you won't let them have it, or vice versa, you commit to not buying someone else's input, you could really damage someone else's business even if you don't compete head to head. And so those
Mhm.
kinds of theories do exist and they're out there a lot and people are thinking about them. And then just finally, very briefly, I think you're right. I mean, something of what made people get interested in these tech cases was Google and Facebook and Apple and Amazon and others. they do play an outsized role in people's lives. And so people were
Mhm.
thinking, these people do have a lot of market power. We really love them. Is there something they're doing that is reducing competition? Because we're using their products all the time. And if they are, then we
Right.
really want to know about it.
Right. Does the DOJ or FTC ever step in if and this kind of happens not necessarily through merger and acquisitions, but say Amazon is a great example where Amazon starts as a book business and then gets into data and gets into servers and then gets into storage, and then they get into the film studios and stuff like that. And like you said, all of a sudden, this company has an outsized proportional relevance or impact on really everyone's lives. And they may make the argument, hey, we just kind of developed this in-house in our own business. And this is America, and aren't we allowed to do that? And this is just free business, isn't this?
Yeah, and you're hitting what's a really tricky issue for antitrust, which is we want companies competing as hard as they can. And when you compete as hard as you can, that sometimes means you get really big because you're really good at what you do and you become really successful. And the line is usually it's fine for you to become big through growth. You just do a great job, you serve your customers well, people really
Mhm,
want your products. Most antitrust people would say, that's great. That's exactly what we want you to do. Get out there and
mhm,
try to give the consumer a better deal and win customers in that way. What
mhm,
antitrust gets upset about is if you say, you know what, it's a lot of hard work figuring out what customers want. I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to buy our rival instead. And that way we can get rid of that competition and we can just take it a little easy here because we're really tired of running at full speed.
right,
Or you say, we're going to do something. We're going to tell our suppliers, just making up an example, hey, you can do what you want. But if I find out that you're supplying your products with our rival, we're not going to buy from you anymore. And if you're the bigger company, and I'm just making up an example here, you might be able to drive a rival out of business or raise their costs enough that you can just have a little bit of breathing space. And now you're not
mhm,
competing for your customers in the way you would. And that hurts American consumers. And so then, yes, the FTC and the DOJ, the various groups there are keeping an eye on industries, and if it comes to their attention, usually the way it works is somebody complains. So a customer says, I used to have competition for my business, but now somebody is doing this thing that makes it hard for me to compete. Another source of complaints is a rival might say, hey, I used to compete with Nicholas's business, but now he's been like threatening my suppliers and I can't compete with this guy anymore. You got to do something
mhm,
here. And the both agencies will, if they get that kind of complaint and the complaint is credible, they'll look into it. And they may or may not bring a lawsuit. They may send a letter saying, Nicholas, stop threatening your rival's suppliers or whatever it is. Or if, whatever I'm doing, I just keep doing, they might bring a lawsuit and challenge me in court.
right. Right, right. And so that lawsuit would hypothetically prevent the business from expanding into other businesses where the government will say, "Hey, Amazon, you have too much of a market share. You can't also get into the movie studio business. You can't also buy 21st Century or whatever, not 21st Century, or Lionsgate or whatever it was they bought." But
Yeah, MG, they bought
that would
M.
only be the case if it was brought to their attention actively by the consumers and they were actually having an impact on people.
I think they bought MGM. So yeah, I think
Yeah,
so.
right.
It's a nuanced answer. Generally, expanding into new businesses, they will generally think, "Hey, that might be pro-competitive." So today we have a bunch of people competing to sell coffee to us, and Amazon says we're launching Amazon Coffee. We're going to buy a bunch of beans super cheap. It's going to be like
Mhm.
the spirit of coffee. It's going to be cheap, and it may not be the very highest quality, but boy, is it going to be affordable. And that they might say that, well, that seems like competition. Now that's going to put pressure on Pete's and Starbucks and whomever else you buy your coffee from. And so they might like that. If Amazon said, and I'm just using this as a purely hypothetical, I don't think there's any plans to enter the coffee business, but if they took some kind of action to enter coffee and restrict the ability of others to compete, then they might have an investigation. And so that's
Mhm.
really the key thing. Like the generally you're okay if you enter an industry and you just compete. If you take some kind of action that makes it harder for others to compete, other than the fact that you're competing with them, that's when you're at risk of getting an antitrust investigation. Both DOJ and FTC, they'll certainly respond if there are complaints, but just in the
Sure.
ordinary course, if they learn about something, if in their own life they see, hey, there used to be different coffee on every corner, and now Hill's Coffee has driven them all out of business, someone may
Mhm.
say, we should take a look at Hill's Coffee. How did this happen?
Yeah, but I would imagine though that this would probably be, for example, let's say again, I'm sorry, with the studio, with the film studio with Amazon, right? And this had really happened. They got the Lord of the Rings franchise, and they got the rights to it, and they developed a script, and they made I believe it was a series. I don't think I believe it was a series, and they already had the backing. They had the operations, they had the marketing power, they had the ability to take a piece of tape on every single Amazon Prime box that anyone was buying, and stick their Lord of the Rings logo and marketing and advertising on it, and they're entering, an industry with a whole 'nother level of power that and, I'm not talking about Amazon in particular because there are a lot of studios that are doing this. Apple does this too, I'm sure, and Apple has no problem throwing money at a lot of and they have more cash than they know what to do with, and they have no problem throwing money at Martin Scorsese or any big director, or any big actor's name to be able to develop a movie for $500 million. And you know what? But that's because we're Apple, and normally no one would have made this. Whatever. The studios wouldn't have necessarily even created this. And now because we are in another business or other businesses, and we have other forms of backing, and we now have we therefore have, I guess, more effective means, or a better a much bigger advantage than anyone else, and we're just getting started in the game. Does that ever come into consideration, or not really?
Yeah, so nuanced answer. It's a very interesting question, and I'll just give you some anecdotes to talk about it. So
Sure.
I testified on the Penguin Random House's attempt
Yes.
to acquire Simon and Schuster, and I testified for the government, and we eventually prevailed in court, and the merger was blocked. And
Mhm.
one issue there that we said, hey, look, there's going to be a reduction in competition. Like authors today can play off the members of the Big Five, and that this is going to lead to lower reimbursement for authors, so they'll get paid less,
Mhm.
and that's that. And the defense said, "Hey, but look, there's entry and expansion here, and you could look if we reduce competition, some other publisher will come in and compete." So, they had other arguments as well. I don't mean to give them short shrift, but the key issue there was this one key issue was this entry question. And there it ties back to your question because Amazon at one time tried to enter publishing. And,
Mhm.
you could say Amazon has a lot of money. They're a very large company. And you might say, well, if they try to enter publishing, they're going to be successful. They weren't successful, and they're not today playing any material role as far as I know in publishing. It's been a while since I looked at it, but they're not a major publisher. And this is one of those interesting things. Like you pick almost any industry, you could say, well, Apple has enough money to enter that if they want to. But from Apple's perspective, the question is, okay, I'm going to have to spend a bunch of money to do this. Is it worth my while to do it? Or should I invest in making an even better iPhone or an even better iPad or something like that? And
Mhm.
so, you can always think somebody could do it. And in antitrust, the question is, would they actually do it? Like, would it be
Right.
profitable for them to do that? And so, in general, if firms are trying to enter new markets, they'll get a reasonable amount of leeway. If tomorrow, pick your favorite tech company, let's say Google said, we are launching Google Airways and we're going to fly from place to place, people would say, okay, well, we'll see where this goes. Maybe this will be great, maybe it won't. But they would generally, I would think, the attitude of the FTC, or well, DOJ does airlines, and I think they would say, let's see what happens. Like this could be new valuable competition. The way it would cause a problem is if, whoever the new entrant was took some kind of actions to restrict the ability of others to compete. Like it's fine
Mhm.
to compete on the merits. You can go in there and say, we are going to offer a better deal to customers, and that's why we're going to win. And if you do that, that's great. What's going to get you in hot water is if you say, you know what, it's hard to do that. We don't like doing that. We're going to make it hard for Ephraim to compete because right now he's got a really big market share. We're going to cut off his supply or we're going to do something else. That's what gets you in trouble. But if you just go in and say, we're going to outcompete him by offering a higher quality and a lower price, generally people will be saying, that's fine. There's no antitrust problem there.
That's it. That's cool. That's very interesting. I am curious though, it would again, back just to the Hollywood example, and this could apply this to any industry you want, but it does make a difference when and obviously you're correct. Amazon is not guaranteed success in the in the movie space, and neither is Amazon. I mean, historically, I don't even think they have been particularly. They're as far as the Nielsen charts and as far as the eyes on the screen. They're far from the top, but they do affect the competition chain and the actual market and the ability to get movies made if and I think Netflix even started this practice where they say, "Hey, Adam Sandler, your typical rate for a movie is $100 million. We'll give you $300 million." And all of a sudden, you're just completely changing the entire scape of what the industry is. Do you say that that's just natural par for the course competition, we'll see what comes out of it? Or do you say, "Hey, you're too busy changing the game and you're causing a real rapid change in a lot of this stuff, and right now and by the way, consumers do suffer from that, and I'm sure that people say that, "Hey, we're not necessarily thrilled with the fact that we have to, that X, Y, and Z content's not great, and we're paying a lot of money for it," or, their excuse that why our membership, costs are going up twice or 3 times a year is because they're putting out more content, but, I mean, no one's asking you to bid $500 million for a movie that could have been made for 120, a couple of years ago. So I am curious that is this just deliberation in court? Is this just nuance and battling this out intellectually? Is that really what a lot of this comes down to?
Yeah. So backing up, I'll take your Amazon purchase of MGM. So what the review process there, I think one way you could think about it is to switch the context and think about airlines. So
Right.
suppose American was for sale and United
Mhm,
said, we want to buy American. This was rumored in the press. I have no idea if there's any truth to it or not, whether they're considering it or
mhm,
not. But if that did happen, then I think what DOJ would say is, well, today you guys overlap and compete on a bunch of routes. Like today, there are routes where customers are choosing or considering between American and United and potentially other competitors.
right.
And so they would take a look at that. If Apple came in and said, we are buying uh, who did I say was for sale? American? We're buying American then, or we're buying United, whichever one. DOJ would certainly be interested and say, okay, what are the effects here? But they would probably say, well, you don't today compete to fly people from place to place. So I guess this could reduce competition, but I don't really see the issue. And so
Mhm,
in all of these things, when somebody buys somebody else, it comes sort of down to if you're both competing to serve the same customers today, so you're competing with each other head to head every day, the more you
mhm,
do that, the more if you try to merge, the government's going to say, wait a minute, for a lot of customers, you two are among their best options, and you're saying you're going to merge and not compete for them anymore. We want to
right,
know whether that's going to make them worse off. Is that going to reduce
right.
their options? So the same thing with Amazon and MGM. Are you both making a lot of movies? If so, are there other competitors? Is this going to reduce competition? What does that all look like in that big picture? And
But they don't
then
look at industry
the
disruption as a
oh yeah.
whole? Sorry?
I'd say, yeah, sorry. So an industry disruption, really, again,
Like, I
it
would call the price
depends.
of
Like if
movies
you,
going up double the or triple the price. I would call that a disruption in the industry. Wouldn't you?
yeah, so it would depend. Like remember in an antitrust merger, well, there's two kinds of antitrust mergers. One reviews. One is before the deal happens. So
Okay.
United says we're buying American, or Apple says we're buying American. The DOJ and the court have to make a decision, or the states have to make a decision before they know what's going to happen. So if you think
Mhm.
about a normal crime, and this, I mean, it's a different kind
Sure.
of issue. But if you think about theft, like you ask the question, did Nicholas steal money from Ephraim or not? And if I did, if I stole that picture that's on the wall behind you, it's like, okay, he's got it, he did it or he didn't. You wouldn't be able to go to court and say, I think Nicholas is planning to steal my poster. People would say, okay, well, that's great, but let us know when he
Yeah,
does, and then we'll take action.
yeah.
In antitrust mergers, you have to make a decision before it happens. That said, there are cases in antitrust where people have gone back and said, hey, by the way, we didn't think there was a problem here, but you guys merged and then you raised price 500%. So it looks like we got something wrong. So we need to look at this.
Wow. There were
Now,
cases of that?
in that ca yeah, yeah, there's a famous hospital case called the Evanston case where 2 hospital systems merged, and afterwards, the FTC said, "We can't help but notice that you guys have raised price since you merged, and you raised price more than other people, and it seems like maybe that merger is anti-competitive." And the FTC won, and they ended up, I can't remember what the exact remedy was, but so to your point, if you merge, let's say you and I merge and we raise our lemonade prices 500%, and the government comes in and says, well, guys, you know what? I think I see a problem here. We might be in trouble. Or here's where we might not be. If we said, hey, we did raise price 500%, but here's what you should know. the price of lemons and sugar went up 500%. That's why we raised price, because otherwise we'd be selling all this stuff for a loss. And by the
Mhm.
way, Joe down the street from us has now entered and he's competing with us every day. And we're not making any money. Like we're making, in fact, our margin, the amount we make on a glass of lemonade is exactly the same as before we merged.
Right.
If those were the facts, then we'd have a good story. If it was the case that lemons and sugar didn't change price and water didn't change price, and you and I just jacked up the price 500% after the merger, we'd probably be in pretty hot water. So,
I hope so. I would hope so.
yeah,
I would
exactly. That's how it's supposed to work.
I would love to, and now I wanna talk about this, and, obviously as objectively as possible. Is there, there's always, and I emailed you about this beforehand, there's always in a lot of big industries or anything that has regulation, a quote unquote revolving door, the revolving door phenomenon, where people go from private to public sectors and they take with them a lot of times relationships, trade secrets, different perspectives or insider knowledge that they may have to put them in a unique position within the company. So for example, when Purdue Pharma would hire people from the FDA to after their careers at FDA, or after people at the DEA would get hired by a pharmaceutical company, part of their role was to be almost advisory in how do we kind of avoid the regulation? How do we get around this and succeed and be as successful as a corporation as you could be? And by the way, I hear where that game plan comes from. I can't say I like the idea, but as a consumer, but whatever, I can understand where they're coming from. Does this happen with the DOJ and the FTC? How would this manifest? Does this happen based on industry exclusively? And is like the DOJ and the FTC, because there's so many different cases that you're taking on, you're not necessarily inclined to be drawn into one particular privatized industry? How exactly would that, or does it not work?
Yeah. So it's interesting. It does vary a little bit by agency, I would say. The DOJ traditionally, a lot of its recruiting came from what was known, I think is still known as its honors program. So it would hire attorneys straight out of law school.
Mhm,
And then they were just trained. And I don't know what the percentages were, but my observation was a lot of DOJ attorneys came through that route. So DOJ was
mhm,
sort of recruiting people fresh out. FTC definitely does that too. But the FTC would also say, here's someone who's been in private practice for 5 years. They're good at what they do. They're credible when they present to us. We want that person to work for us. Like they know how things look on the other side and they can give us a perspective we otherwise wouldn't have. And so
mhm,
I'm not saying one approach or the other is better, but they both certainly, I would say DOJ tended to be more the honors and FTC tended to be a mix of hiring people out of it from law firms or hiring people fresh out of law school. And
mhm,
then people will work at the agencies and they will leave and they will go to work at a law firm, or in my case, they'll go from working in the agency as an economist and go to work for a consulting firm. And couple thoughts on that. One, there isn't, if you think about the revolving door, like going back and forth frequently, that really doesn't happen that much. Like what happens a lot is someone works for the agency, they do it for like, say, 10, 15 years, and then they think, I'd like to try private sector, and they do that. Or vice versa.
mhm,
They go to the law firm, they build a career, and then they say, I'd like to see what it's like being at the government. Multiple spins through that door are relatively uncommon, at least in my experience. Usually you start one place, you might go the other. Some people do there, and back, but that's relatively rare. And then I would say, from my experience at both agencies, if you're an ex agency alumni, so I worked with you, I know you, I'm usually a little more polite in my questions, but it doesn't change the analysis. Ultimately, if you come in with a dumb story,
yeah,
you and I have done our 500% deal, and an ex agency person comes in and says, "Oh, you shouldn't worry about it because look, I mean, lemonade, whatever. It's not that important." They come up
sure,
with some really good reason why we shouldn't care. The staff are going to say the exact same thing. They're going to say, yeah, this isn't a credible story. Like, we still like Bob, great guy. We really enjoyed working with him. But on this one, his story doesn't make a lot of sense. And then
yeah,
on top of that, you have two other layers. One is the political layer. Those people generally don't have those past relationships with works. And then ultimately in our US system, things end up in court. And for sure, the judge has no idea who these people are, and the judge is just going to look at the merits. Like in
Right.
all these cases, you work backwards from what would happen in court. Like if you and I do our merger, we raise price 500%, and we know we're going to lose in court, then when we're dealing with the agency, we're really in a posture where we're saying, let's try to figure out if there's a solution or if we just have to go back to competing independently. And so because of those various layers, I, at least in my time in the agencies, I really didn't see any example where it was, well, we kind of like, Janet because she was here and we worked with her. So we're going to say yes to our client when we had otherwise said no.
Right.
Ultimately, especially the agencies, the people tend to be really mission focused. Like they do work for a lot less money. They work really long hours. They're doing it because they care about US consumers. And that sort of trumps any, we worked
Mhm.
together once or we used to be pals. And, at least that's been my experience. Others may have had a different experience.
Sure, and I totally get that, and that makes a lot of sense. I was actually thinking a little bit more along the lines, and to take it back to our lemonade stand, that you and I have our lemonade stands, and I know that if we jack up our prices 500%, the federal government's gonna come after us, but I do know that having spent 3 years, Ephraim spent 3 years at the DOJ or the FTC, and I know that jacking up 200%, will probably fly under the radar. And so, say, hey, Nicholas, I had a couple of, I spent a couple of years there, and I do know that we don't want them coming after us. So why don't we just stick it to what I know is 250%, and then anything above that it's already getting greedy, but that's also going to attract attention. I know that there are X, Y, and Z uh, formats, layouts.
Yeah, I see. I got you.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. No,
sure.
that makes sense. So I think, yeah. So from the perspective of, so usually, let's say our joint lemonade company, we're hiring an antitrust lawyer, and we say, look, have you worked at the agencies? Because we want to know what you know, and it's that experience of working at the agencies can be very helpful for understanding how the process is going to work. They'll say to us, look, here's how
Mhm.
it's going to work. You guys want to merge. You're going to have to file your HSR form. That's a form you have to file to merge. Then they'll probably review it. We might have some calls, like they can walk you through the steps and tell you how it's going to work. And so that direct experience of the process can be really valuable. I'm not an attorney, so I don't really see them counseling outside of, when I'm on the phone.
Sure.
What I will say is on the phone, what they will typically say is, look, I can't tell you what to do. I'm just the lawyer here, but I can tell you here are the things that are likely going to get you into are going to present risk for you on the antitrust side. And if you and
Mhm.
Nicholas merge and Ephraim Hill Lemonade now is 500% more, that's very likely to attract attention. And you probably shouldn't be thinking about doing that. And I think there's this risk of somebody noticing and coming after you. So in a sense, that's the way I've usually seen that play out. They give that kind of assessment, and if and people ask, which they rarely do, because I'm an economist, they usually want to know what the lawyers think. I will say, look, if I was sitting in my hat at the DOJ and I saw this case facts, then this is probably the way I would think about it. And that can be value for them to
Yeah.
understand. Look, if I saw your merger, I'd probably tell you, I think this one's going to get you into trouble. Like if I was the person at the agency reviewing this, I would say, I've got real concerns and it's going to take a while. You're going to have to work with the agency and go through their whole
Mhm.
process. Or I can say, look, if this had come to me when I was at DOJ, I would have said, I don't think it's a problem. This merger's fine. It doesn't reduce competition. It's not going to harm consumers. And so that's usually how that counseling process works. I've not really seen hey, I've been at the agency and I can tell you guys, your new brand of lemonade, you could raise price 313%. But if you go to 314, that's going to be bad news.
Right.
So go up to 313 and stop there. That's not usually how it plays out. Like the businesses, and I just want to emphasize that when I do work directly with the clients, they're almost invariably really nice people. And often in these mergers, they're not
Mhm.
thinking about it in the way that the antitrust is. But anyway, they're usually thinking about the deal for reasons that are sort of unrelated to antitrust concerns. And often they'll say, hey, we know this area is a problem. Could we fix that problem? Because the rest of the deal we think is good.
Right. Okay. That sounds great. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time. This was such a first of all, this hour and a half slipped by real quickly, but I want to say I really enjoyed this. This was very clear, a lot of fun, and gave me a lot of insight and is giving me a lot to think about. So thank you so much for your time and for your patience and your generosity with your time and information. I think this is really, really wonderful. And I think that this hopefully will serve as a really good educational tool for people to have a general idea as to how a lot of this stuff works, what the government's role is. And hopefully, you and I covered a lot of information that could be very useful for people down the line. Thank you.
I hope so. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And I had a lot of fun.
Good. I'm happy to hear. Have a great day. Take care.
You too.
Hello.
Thanks.